responses to those pre-submitted questions to you. I've also added quite a few links of some, I think, some references and some key sources that I think you all might find handy. So first of all, how we're doing with COVID-19 when it comes to our statistics here at the county. Quite frankly, we're doing well. I think there was an idea that we're seeing some spikes in cases. Quite frankly, over the last, over the last few months, we've seen a steady decline. We had a little bit of a precipitous increase with the B2 variant you've heard about, but quite frankly, I think our average roughly over the last 5 to 7 days is in your mid to high 200s. Yesterday's case count for the county was 178 cases, which is pretty significant since we've been in the thousands in the past. Maybe even more indicative of where we are as far as combating the most recent variants and kind of seeing the light at the end of the tunnel with COVID-19 response is our 30-day outlook over our hospitalization. And over the last 30 days, we've seen a decline by over 52% in our hospitalized patients census. So currently, through all of our hospitals throughout the county, we're at about 108 that are hospitalized due to COVID-19. When you look at our ICUs patient census, we're actually at 22 folks that are basically in ICU with COVID-related symptoms. In the last 30 days, that's a decline in about 60%. Right now, our case rate, if you're even into that, is about 6.2 cases per 100,000. And I'm just going to shift gears really into telling you how we're doing on the vaccine side, and then I'll get into some of these specific questions you have for me. I'd argue really at our level with this particular county, I'd argue we're leading the nation, especially for the size of the county. This is the second largest county in the state, next to LA County with 3.3 million. Roughly right now, or not roughly, our percentage of eligible population with at least one dose in this county is 94.1%. That's tremendous. The percent of eligible population that's fully vaccinated, your 2 doses or your J&J, is 82.7%. That is, again, extraordinary when it comes to the size of this particular county. On the booster side, with the eligible population for boosters, we've actually boosted 1.2 million residents. That's 55.7% of our residents have been boosted. So again, those are pretty good stats, and I think the fact that a lot of us have had COVID, but a lot of us also have been vaccinated. We as a county, I think, are in a pretty good position as we kind of transition maybe into more of an endemic phase, just dealing with COVID-19 as we've dealt with other similar type illnesses, flu, what have you. So with that, that's kind of an opening. I will absolutely get into some reopening questions, and I want to make sure I provide you any time for any questions that may have not been pre-submitted. So with that, Jason or Summer, does anybody want to just kick off the questions and we'll get after it?
Sure, I could certainly do that. Very glad to hear that we're in a better suited position, even on a national level. So, but one of the questions is, now that we're seeing a spike in cases in San Diego, what resources would you direct employers or employees to remind everyone of best practices and keeping their workforce safe?
Thanks for the question. Again, I just kind of reviewed that we're down, quite frankly, on almost all of our metrics indicators with respect to cases, health, and death rates. So in that regard, we got to continue doing what we're doing. I think one of the great things that we are doing is it's the vaccination piece. I think we continue to encourage vaccination. It is an individual decision, but we do think that based on the evidence that we've got, that vaccinations are doing well in support of our COVID protocols. The other thing that we kind of talk about, folks, is layered mitigation efforts. There's a lot of things that are no longer required or mandated, as it was way back when we had physical distancing requirements and things like that. But depending on what you're doing, the events you're holding, activities you're participating in or hosting, you still may consider layered mitigation efforts, which could include face coverings if you so desire. Although in the state there's no longer a face covering mandate, it still is highly recommended, and nothing stops an individual, employee or otherwise, or an organization or an event organizer from requiring higher restrictions or greater restrictions than your local or state government. So the one thing that we talk about is minimizing, the ventilation in indoor spaces. You maximize what you can get with the airflow. Testing when it's recommended by guidance, or when, especially if anybody's got symptoms, is something you need to do. The typical stay at home if you are symptomatic, not feeling well. And as we said, I'll get into more detail with, considering some of those best practices that we used in the past. Doesn't mean that they can't be utilized by yourselves, depending on, again, what it is that you're doing. I've got a list of about, 6 or 7 websites for businesses that I'll send to everybody through Summer and Jason after this call. I think that's it for the first question. Why don't we move on to the second?
Sure. So for the updates, not too long ago, Moderna and Pfizer got FDA emergency authorization for second booster doses. What are the recommendations there, and when do we expect eligibility to expand to everybody?
Yeah, another great question. And again, I got to emphasize, the vaccination piece gets a little bit politically, sensitive at times. It's an individual choice matter. I've been vaccinated and boosted myself, but as a former Marine, I'm not scared or worried about the virus. I just thought it was my duty to do it. So again, that's the first recommendation: is make folks, give careful consideration. Look at our website, look at other websites, make an informed decision on whether or not you get vaccinated, and or if you want to get boosted. Outside of that, the FDA and the CDC and California Department of Public Health have authorized a second booster dose of the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines for people 50 years of age and older, and for people 12 years and older with certain immune compromising conditions. The Moderna, so you all know, can only be used currently for those 18 or older. I'll get into some more of that in a minute. The second booster dose will be an option after at least 4 months from the first booster of any authorized or approved COVID vaccine. So you got to have a 4-month wait that's required in there. And I think right now there's no decisions being made for further booster doses after the second, although people are already asking that question. I think that's got it on that question. Do we want to move to the next one?
Sure. So for the locally, do we still have to report positive cases to the county?
I think for the local positive cases and outbreaks should be reported to local public health. And I think I'll also make sure you've got a link to this when I send you this document back. The Cal OES emergency temporary standards. Those were the standards that they established to help employees protect them, obviously, during the response phase. The governor just basically approved that for a third turn on the current ETS standards. So they've been again approved for another 90 days. And I actually sent the updated ETSs this summer. I even sent a link that shows you what's the lineouts, where did they make some changes. And I think it's a very helpful document. So you can go through the one where they actually made some updates for this third rendition of the ETSs. And I've got those also linked in this document. I'll send the whole thing to you all, but I know Summer also has those links I sent because that just came across a few days ago. Next question.
Great. I know you touched a little bit upon it regarding events, and we're starting to see them come back, obviously at a much larger number, thankfully, for at least our local economy, especially. And this, I know this started on April 1st, but as the county and state lifted the vaccine or test requirements for indoor mega events, what are the best practices here in our businesses that hold large events required to notify attendees in any event of exposure or breakout?
Yeah, thanks, Jason. Another tremendous question, and this is one I do get quite often from a lot of our event planners, big and small here. The first thing I always kind of emphasize, first and foremost, is kind of like the three rules for effective communication. What do I know? Who have I told? Who else needs to know? So I'd say information and education with not only your employees, but those that will participate or attend your events. One best practice is absolutely signage. And I think we've got, on our county website, and I can provide a link to that, we have an education and information section where we've got a ton of product up there that you all could take a look at, pick and choose, and tailor to your needs for whatever you all are doing. I also think that even what kind of information and updates you provide, in your registration processes is really, really good, especially if you want to put any type of restrictions. If you want to mandate things like a testing verification, or you want to mandate, test face coverings, things like that, be upfront in your registration process on kind of some of the restrictions that you want to basically implement during your event. The other thing I think, as I said before, a lot of things that we did routinely when COVID was at its peak are still applicable depending on what it is you want to do, but they're not mandatory. Things like the hygiene and sanitation protocols. I think hygiene stations, hand washing stations are kind of here to stay. And I think when you maximize those in and around your facility, your event, that's a good thing. Again, and signage, and encourage folks to do that. You can still do physical distancing. It doesn't have to be overly regimented, but where you can open up spaces and distance, your contractors, your vendors, where you can try to keep congestion in lines. Anything that you can do in regards to spreading things out is still a very effective, a measure, protocol, best practice. And then I also talk to reopening plans. You'll see in the ETS standards for employers, you have to kind of have a COVID program. But I'm talking about more or less a reopening plan. If you're going to have an event, what are the restrictions? Lay those out, codify those. I always am a big fan of when you lay out your site, put it on paper so you know how things are spread up. What are the duties and responsibilities of your employees and your volunteers? What kind of restrictions are you going to consider putting in place? Your employees need to know that, and then you need to know how exactly you plan on, gaining compliance from everybody, especially if you're adding restrictions that are maybe more strict than the state and local government. And when you do that, any type of restrictions that you place, I know you all know this better than me. If you even go more strict, I always recommend get with your legal counsel, those that provide you some legal counsel, and or your HR, and review some of the things that you plan on doing so that you can kind of get their buy-in and see what potential impacts you might have to deal with if you are more strict. It sounds funny, but trust me, as you know, you can never make everybody happy, and everybody these days seems to want to sue one another for whatever reason. That's probably enough on that one, but it is a very good one. And I'm happy also with myself and the folks that I can pull in from the county. If you have a big event, an activity, and you want somebody to take a look at what your plan is, feel free to contact me directly or through Summer, whoever, and I'd be happy to pull a few folks in on my team to take a look at your plan and provide you some input. We've been doing that for almost 2.3 years, and still happy to do it for anybody that wants to give us a shot at that. Not a requirement, but definitely an offer. Next question, Jason.
Well, thank you for offering that. I'm sure a few folks here will probably take advantage of that. Follow up to something related earlier. If someone tests positive using an at-home test, does the employer have to report it as well?
Yeah, I'm actually sorry. I'm looking at one of the questions. I don't know if I answered them. I'm going to come back to the one you just asked, but there was a question in here about businesses that hold large events. Are they required to notify attendees in the event of an exposure or breakout? The answer to that is, if you have an employee and it's at your workplace or the event, so to speak, then that's something that you'll have to report and you'll have to follow the emergency temporary standards. But anybody just attending, you would not have to do any type of contract case investigations or contact tracing or anything like that. That's not your requirement. You're only required really for your employees at the workplace. And I'm sorry, Jason, can you repeat the last question you had?
Yeah, just if the employer if somebody tests positive using an at-home test, would the employer, if they were to know that that employee tested positive at home, does the employer have to report that?
No, and that's a great question, and that's kind of captured in the emergency temporary standards question and answers. They're FAQs. First of all, any type of take-home test still has to be validated. Whether it's validated, via FaceTime or whatever by the employer, you've got some kind of a medical representative that can basically validate the home test. That's the first thing. But the only really requirement the employer has to concern him or herself with is what happens at the workplace. So even if they're working from home, That's not necessarily, it's at the workplace, the building, because really what it gets down to is what can the employer control? The employer can't control kind of who's coming and going out of the house, what's going on in the house as far as what type of protocols they're following, not following, but they can and should be able to do that at their specific work location. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for that answer on that. If you don't mind, we'll move to business or business travel. We're getting back to work-related travel. What happens if an employee tells you that they've tested positive? What should you advise other employees that may have had exposure?
Yeah, again, another great question, guys. In most business settings, like in the general public, quarantine is no longer required for close contacts. And I can, the close contact the definition hasn't changed. Matter of fact, it's captured in the emergency temporary standards. They've got a list of definitions of all kinds of different terms. So close contacts, regardless of vaccination status, what they do say is you should, and I say should, not a mandate, they should test within 5 to 7 days after their last exposure. And it says also in the guidance that they should, quote unquote, should wear a well-fitting mask around others for a total of 10 days. Because even if you come off you come off an isolation period after 5 days, what the emergency temporary standards tell you is that, hey, even though you basically are kind of off formal isolation, when you go back to your workplace, return to work guidance, it says that you should wear that mask for the final 5 days of the 10-day isolation period. It also says that if symptoms develop, test and stay home. If the test is positive, you follow the isolation recommendations. Those are also outlined in the emergency temporary standards. And then again, we always kind of remind folks that when you look at our statistics, being vaccinated can minimize the chance of becoming infected to begin with. So again, we always encourage folks to continue to look and consider that along with boosters. And I've got a link that I'm also providing in the response back, Jason. It's guidance on isolation and quarantine for COVID-19. That comes from the California Department of Public Health. That's also linked in the formal responses that I've provided to your questions.
Great.
Next question, sir.
Thank you. So with related to business travel, I know you mentioned a little bit about the quarantine process if folks travel, but do employers still need to report cases to the county if an employee tested positive while traveling on work?
Yeah, this goes kind of back to what I kind of indicated with the home being at home. The answer is no, and it goes back to the ETS FAQs. It's workplace. Again, the employer is not going to be able to control necessarily what's going to happen on an airplane and what the employer can necessarily do or don't do when traveling. And so because of that lack of control, so to speak, then there's no requirement. But the relationship between employees and employers, again, that's something that I can't get into. But if there's good trust and confidence in there, I think you're going to have the employees, speaking to the employers and vice versa. But that's really on them, how open their communication is and the relationships they have with their workforce. I hope that answers that question, and I'm ready for anything else you got.
Great. That's mostly it. I mean, if there's anything else, I know you have a hard stop here. You're a very busy person, so we're very happy you're able to take the time here with us. But if there's anything else you'd like to close with or words of wisdom or advice, happy to hear it.
Yeah, I really apologize because I do have to meet with some of our senior leadership. We got a couple other helmet fires that we're dealing with here, as I say. But I will just say this is, first of all, I thank you for everybody and what you've been doing and hanging in there over the last over 2 years of this. It's amazing how long it's been. We're not totally out of the woods yet, but we're getting there. I just think we need to stay focused on what we can do. And be aware of the guidance, the requirements, and whatnot. There's very few left. But again, I'm at your service here with the county to take any questions you have anytime, look over any type of plans you're thinking about. And if there's any questions that come up in the rest of this meeting, please capture those. Summer and Jason will get those to me, and I'll respond same day. So with that, sir, thank you for the opportunity again. And that's all I have for you today.
Thank you so much, Gary. Everybody, that was Gary Johnston, the Chief Resilience Officer for the San Diego County Office of Emergency Services. Thank you for keeping us safe and informing our businesses, Gary.
Thank you. Take care.
All right, next up, we'd like to introduce our next speaker. Mr. Robert Moutrie, who is the policy advocate for the California Chamber of Commerce. He'll be discussing items such as changes to Cal OSHA, what to expect from them, the permanent standard, and potentially some other items as well. So with that, I'd like to introduce Robert, or Rob.
Rob is fine. Thank you, Jason. And really want to say thank you to Gary. I think that was a wonderful presentation. So for background, Robert Moutrie, I'm an attorney for the California Chamber of Commerce, as well as a policy advocate, handling a range of topics from workplace safety to education to unemployment insurance. Obviously here to talk about COVID-19 and particularly what's coming. I think I can touch on legislation, but I wanted to focus on the practical side, which is what's coming with the, I'm not sure why my camera shut off. Sorry about that. I want to particularly focus on what's coming with the COVID-19 workplace regulation, which Gary referred to repeatedly, right? And as you all know, right, there's kind of two worlds you have to simultaneously look at it as a business right now in California when you're trying to be ready for COVID-19. There's the CDPH guidance, which obviously deals with, particularly those of you with some very public workplaces to a degree. And then there's the COVID-19 ETS, or the Emergency Temporary Standard, which is the emergency regulation on COVID, which is going to be the prime document for you. That's going to be really where you're focused. And so I'll go through here. Gary mentioned that there was a recent change from the governor related to the new COVID-19 regulation. That was the third readoption, which happened in December and has gone into effect now. And it should be in effect, well, is in effect presently, and hopefully you have already implemented. If not, I understand this moves very quickly and it can be hard to keep up. But on the Cal Chamber side, we're already looking towards the fourth readoption, which is already scheduled with Cal OSHA. They'll be having a vote later this month on April 21st to look at what will be the final round of changes to the emergency regulation. That vote, and just being candid, it will pass. Cal OSHA has been very clear, the board members are very clear. Even if they have specific concerns about policies, they're not ready to end the emergency regulation yet. So we have every estimation it will pass on April 21st. When it does, it will go into effect in May, probably around May 1st. And that will be in effect until the end of this year, calendar-wise. It'll be in effect till December 31st. Now, that's a long period for an emergency regulation, but the governor issued an executive order particularly allowing for this extension to go extra long. So it'll be in effect basically from May to December 31st. Now, it's easy to say it will be in effect. What will that be? I'm going to put a number of links in the chat. I'm also going to provide them to Summer and Jason afterward, but hopefully those go correctly. So there's a lot of links there. I'll go through them bit by bit, but the first important one you want to know is that Cal OSHA has already put out the red line on what they're going to vote on in April and what that will be vis-a-vis the present standard. So that amongst the links I just put in there for you, that's going to be the second link where it says text for changes. If you go to that second link, you can see a red line comparing the present COVID-19 emergency regulation to what will be in effect then. And I'm going to highlight, I don't know if we want to go through on share screen because it's a lot of text, but I'm going to verbally highlight a couple of pieces for you. Did the links not go into chat? Oh, I'm sorry, that went to the hosts and panelists only. Let me post again. This should go to everyone. There we go. So now, thank you for asking. That should now be available to all of you. So I'm going to go through and verbally highlight, I think, what are some of the larger changes. And then we can, I'm glad to answer any questions to the extent that's helpful. So a couple of the larger changes which you should be looking for coming after the April 21st meeting. The number one question we always get is what's happening with exclusion pay, right? Now we have sick leave recently with the governor's action. You know, is exclusion pay going to continue? And how do I mix those two things together? You know, our helpline gets that all the time. Sadly, from our perspective, exclusion pay is continued in this next version of the regulation until December. So you are going to be having to deal with the new sick pay requirements and separately exclusion pay. I'll just rip that Band-Aid right off. So that's the first piece that you should be aware of. Okay, but what changes then? So number one positive change I can flag for you relates to testing and post-exposure testing, return to work testing. Some of you may have dealt with this issue that the prior draft seemed to say you had to have a proctored test for your employees. You had to have someone watching them when they tested to verify that test. Now that was textually in the regulation. Almost nobody was actually doing that because it was widely viewed as being so kind of absurd, right? I don't want to bring them into the workplace. I want them to test at home. I don't want them bringing it in. So please let them test at home and then tell me how it went. That's better for all of us. I can anecdotally tell you that that's actually even what state workers were doing. I spoke to someone at, I won't say which agency, but I spoke to a state worker when that text change happened in January and said, you guys realize these tests all have to be proctored now. And it was that's nutty. And they say, well, we're not doing that. We're just taking a photo of the test that we took that morning and sending it to our supervisor. And if the photo has a date on it, we're good. So that's one positive change where they've recognized what everyone's actually doing by saying you don't need to have that proctored. You can just say, okay, take a test, take a picture of the test you took that has a date on it. So I know you took the picture today and not 6 months ago, basically. And then send that to me, and that's fine for a test under the reg. Another change in the reg, which Gary mentioned in passing, they have removed completely the requirements about surface cleaning. In the last version and third readoption that happened in around the turn of the year, you had a reduction from, you don't have to disinfect every day, but you still have to do some cleaning. This next version removes the cleaning section entirely. I think that's a reflection of moving towards endemic status and the growing understanding that this is not as much a surface transmitted disease. Now, to what Gary just said, I don't know if he's still here, but to his point, hand washing and taking care, you can, those things are always good, and you can always do more at a business if you want to. But that requirement will be removed from the regulation to be aware of. The other big changes you'll see relate to masking and exclusion from the workplace, right? So when do my workers have to mask? And if there's a case or an exposure, what do I have to do? How long do I have to be excluded? Basically, the regulation is going to be catching up with, you probably all heard about the governor's executive orders over the holidays, right? We had the end of masking kind of declared in the state. Well, that wasn't in the regulations text, actually, until now. So I got a number of people calling saying, wait, I'm reading the ETS. It looks like I still have to mask. What's going on? So they're going to catch up with that. And now you have the removal of the masking requirement, even for unvaccinated workers in the workplace, being formalized. I should note, Gary kind of touched on this in passing. That removal does not mean there's absolutely no masking requirements in the state. You have high risk settings, hospitals, transit hubs, places like that. You should still be aware. But generally speaking, for most workplaces now, those masking requirements are gone. A second change that's catching up is that exclusion duration change. As you guys likely know, CDPH shortened the exclusion durations over the holidays, and then there was an issue of they were inconsistent with Cal OSHA's regulation. Cal OSHA's regulatory text now just refers to CDPH. So you'll have to be looking there. And that brings me to, I think, what is one of the big takeaways, I'll circle back to this, is as you have been, you're going to need to keep looking in multiple places this year. You're going to be looking at the Cal OSHA regulation, obviously that text, but that text after April will be voted on and won't change again for the year. The places you'll really be looking will be the Cal OSHA FAQs and CDPH's guidance. Those are the two places. If I had to prioritize one, I would tell you, look at the Cal OSHA FAQs, because in the appropriate place, they will direct you to CDPH's pages. So Cal OSHA FAQs are kind of the best. If you're going to save one link from all the links I put in there, I would save the Cal OSHA FAQs link, which is the third link down where it says FAQs. On a practical level, that's the one. Jennifer, I'll just deal with your question briefly and then I'll circle back. So Jennifer asked, any idea why the governor has not decided to reimburse employers for the extra sick leave? This is something that has been discussed, actually. Budget Chair Ting and other even high-ranking Democrats are aware of this, and they feel the political pressure to try to do something to address that cost of sick leave. So that is something that's being discussed. Where it shakes out in the budget, we're going to find out more as we get to the May revise coming up. But that is something that's being discussed by the legislature, and there is some political pressure felt there. I can't promise that a financial solution will shake out, obviously, but that is something that Sacramento is very aware of. Okay, so then circling back to where I was. So if those are the changes that are coming this year, right? You can see the text, you can see that that's coming, and we voted on April 21st. And then you will have that in effect in early May. That'll be in effect till the end of the year, December 31st. and you will be looking for changes there on FAQs. What else are you watching for? Let's say we get through 2023. Right now, we're nearing the end of 2023. The ETS is at the end of its duration. Cal OSHA will be looking for potentially a permanent regulation related to COVID-19. They've flagged that they're going to consider this in December of next year. Way down the road, what it will look like is uncertain at this point, but I just want to flag that that's something Cal OSHA is looking at, potentially a permanent regulation next year. Obviously, there'll be chances to make your voice heard before then. We will certainly be lobbying hard on it, but that is something that may come next year. Cal OSHA is also looking at potentially a broader all infectious disease encompassing standard. Again, something to look for in 2023 and not pressing for you right now. Okay, so that brings me back to the big takeaways. So the big takeaways, look at the new text for the ETS, which I put there in that red line. That is going to be really important for you to look for any changes, particularly around cleaning surfaces, the big one I would highlight for you. But look at that closely, talk to your counsel. And then after that is passed, going into May, really watch the Cal OSHA FAQs, because that's where you're going to see changes. And the FAQs will be updated periodically, sometimes without announcement. So you may just see, hey, 2 weeks ago, these were updated again. Hey, these are updated again next month. I would expect them to be updated somewhere around 8 times probably between that May and December date. So around once a month, you'll see some changes to FAQs. So keep watching them, and then keep watching for CDPH guidance changes. And that's going to keep you up to date. And Gary said, reach out to him freely. I would really encourage that. Reaching out to your local public health department is going to, let's say that you're not sure you understand what those documents are trying to say, and they can be vague. Your local public health department is the one who's going to be operationalizing that and going to be they're going to be the ones who tell you, does this make sense or not? So you staying in touch with them is really a good practice. So that's the touch on the COVID-19 ETS and what's coming for that workplace regulation. I'm glad to pause here for any questions, if that's helpful.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, what does enforcement look like if you're out of compliance on ETS?
Yeah. Good question. If you're out of compliance, I mean, much like any other COVID-19, any other Cal OSHA regulation, you're looking at potentially complaints being filed by employees, which will generate either a letter inspection or an in-person inspection. Cal OSHA, because of the scale of COVID-19 across the state, has usually been using letters and saying, hey, send us all documents about this. Then you get a citation. The citation scale is covered standard for others, you're looking a couple $1,000s or going up, similar to other Cal OSHA violations and depending on severity. And it also depends on if you've had prior violations. So there's a lot of factors in the financial penalty calculation, and also whether it's assessed to be a quote serious violation or assessed to be I don't want to say non-serious, but a non-serious violation. So a lot of pieces there, but you're really usually looking at financial penalties. And you'll want to, if you get that letter from Cal OSHA saying, hey, we have complaints about this, you'll want to talk to counsel to make sure that you litigate that. Because even if there's something where it's like, oh, you're right, we did forget that, there may be issues of downgrading that from a serious to a less serious and negotiating better kind of penalties. So that's generally speaking what enforcement will look like. The cost of PPE. I see a question from Stephanie. It's a good question. The cost of testing and PPE. So the short answer is, well, there's not a great short answer. I think it is, there is a state stockpile of PPE. Do I expect them to kind of cover the cost more than they have been? No. I don't expect them to. The cost of testing, I know the state's put some time and effort into there for local testing sites. And I should flag, you as an employer covered by the ETS, and I believe the FAQ references this as well, can utilize community testing sites that are no cost, right? You're not required to purchase tests for your employees, but what's important is for Cal OSHA is that the employee isn't required to spend money to get that test, essentially to use it. So for example, you can direct them to a community site. There's one still going near my house actually, where you can get a free PCR test. So you can direct them to those places. And if they use them, that's less cost for you. Now, importantly, and just being candid, a free PCR test isn't helpful if your goal is to have the employee come back as soon as possible, right? You want an antigen test because the results are faster. And antigen tests are not being provided free at these places pursuant to legislation. So yeah, there are costs there. And I don't anticipate a lot of relief coming on it. What I also would say is there sometimes are chances to get free ones. I believe the Biden administration's program to request COVID-19 tests, I requested through there. I know that many of my friends did. I'm not sure if they've run out presently, but I would keep an eye on those federally. But to the core of your question, over the course of the year, I would expect those resources to diminish. To the extent they're even out there right now. And this is partially with transition towards smarter from the governor, and partially because the cost of them, the legislature is going to want to back away from that. So I would anticipate those resources decreasing. That's a broader question. Well, Stephanie's got good questions. So a broader question from Stephanie, and I just answered one. I'll answer another. For your context, everyone, I'm not sure you can see these. Stephanie asked, outside the scope of very specific questions, what programs at the state level do you anticipate will help businesses create healthy procedures or protocols going forward? This is going to be where coordination with your local CDPH, right, is going to be huge. You're not going to have a state program that's going to kind of a new state program that's going to pop up. You're going to want to talk to your local public health department, and then you're going to want to talk to Cal OSHA's helpline. They're not helpful for stuff that's hot off the presses, like when this new regulatory change happens on April 21st and it goes into effect May. I wouldn't call them for help on that immediately. It'll take them some time. But if you're looking at drawing up a COVID-19 workplace plan or things like that, they can be helpful there. So those are the two places I would look. I don't anticipate new entities kind of coming out to help in that way. Okay, so I think those are those questions. Any other questions? Any other questions anyone has? Glad to touch on. Otherwise, Jason, I think I'll turn it back over to you, and appreciate the invitation.
Oh, thanks so much, Rob. Super helpful. A lot of great questions answered and great highlights. Everybody heard it here first and multiple times. Make sure you check out Cal OSHA's FAQs to get the most updated responses on everything. Something you should all have probably bookmarked just to make sure you're coming back to.
I do. So I certainly recommend bookmarking both the ETS text and the FAQs. You will go back to it more times than you can count.
Awesome. Well, thanks for your time, Rob. Rob Moutrie, policy advocate for the California Chamber of Commerce. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Jason.
And last but not least, we have Mr. Dan Eaton with Seltzer Caplan with McMahon Vitek. Dan will discuss best practices on compliance with state regulations, among a bunch of other things. So, Dan.
Thanks, Jason. Here's a basic rhetorical question. How do you extract best practices from a pandemic that, as I have said in many media, has been moving faster than the speed of law since its inception? So with that as my challenge, let me go to that because you have heard from the last two speakers some excellent foundational material. I've been asked to speak on 3 specific topics that I will address, but I will also address a couple of others. One is, of course, Cal OSHA. You've heard a lot about Cal OSHA, so I'm not going to spend as much time on that. The other is vaccine mandates, and then the third is California's paid supplemental leave law. And then I will also talk a little bit about other best practices. Many of the points that I am going to raise today, I have addressed in my Law at Work column, including the column that was just published yesterday in the Union Tribune. For those of you who are not familiar, it runs every 2 weeks in the San Diego Union Tribune on the front page of the business section. So let's launch into this with respect to Cal OSHA. You've heard from Rob about what Cal OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health and Standards Board, is going to do next week, next Thursday to be exact, with respect to updating these, I love this word, temporary standards. The first ones were enacted in September of 2020, and here we are still dealing with temporary standards. So let me just highlight a couple of things with respect to best practices, which by definition go beyond the minimal requirements of the law. First, current Cal OSHA regulations require employers to notify employees that have had close contact with a COVID-19 case within 1 business day. And as Gary said in the initial presentation, the definition of close contact hasn't changed. It still means 15 minutes of sustained contact within a 24-hour period, and that isn't going to change in the new regulations. My point is, with respect to best practices, is consider extending that to independent contractors as well. Doing so, you don't have to worry about AB5 or anything like that coming into play. That's not going to turn them all of a sudden into employees because you are providing them with this notification. If you focus on the fact that what we are trying to do is keep people safe, there is a great deal of sense in extending it to independent contractors who work on site. Next point I want to make with respect to Cal OSHA regulations is that the definition of fully vaccinated has not changed since vaccinations first came on board. It still means getting, in effect, the second dose or the one dose of J&J. One thing you might want to do as a best practice is expanding that definition to include boosters for those who are eligible, particularly the first booster, which is now universally eligible. As both speakers have said, Gary and Rob said, you can go beyond as an employer, the minimum that the state requires, which is what the law and regulations are all about. You can't fall under them. And so that is another thing that you might want to consider is at the very least encouraging boosters. And if you have a mandate in place, and I'll talk about mandates in a moment, extending it to requiring boosters. I know I teach, in addition to being a practicing lawyer, I teach at San Diego State, and those of us who teach are required to be boosted. And I think the students are as well, but of course the educational setting is high risk. The next point is that Cal OSHA regulations require employers to provide, quote, effective training and instruction to employees. They've never quite defined what that means, but it does include a number of different topics. One is how employees may participate in the identification and evaluation of COVID-19 hazards in the workplace. That's an important piece because they want employees involved. As you've heard from Rob, when you're talking about enforcement, employees are going to be the whistleblowers typically that are going to get Cal OSHA's attention. So it does make sense to include employees and their representatives, if you're unionized, in this process of identifying and addressing COVID-19 hazards. The next thing is you are required to educate about COVID-19 related benefits. Now, you've heard some talk about that, and the COVID-19 related benefits are shifting almost frankly, at least every 2 or 3 months. So that's something that you want to look at. There is a very good frequently asked questions document from the California EDD that is available that you should check out, that is a good thing that you ought to distribute to your workforce, as well as distributing your own policies with respect to benefits that go beyond the minimums required by the law. Finally, there is a requirement that you educate about how, and I'm quoting here, how to access COVID-19 and testing and vaccination. And here's a kicker: add the fact that vaccination is effective at preventing COVID-19, protecting against both transmission and serious illness or death, close quotes, which effectively turns employers into evangelists for the COVID-19 vaccine. But interestingly, when you talk about the mandate that you provide this, saying that vaccines are good, essentially, there is contrasting somewhat guidance from the Department of Fair Employment and Housing, which of course administers the employment discrimination laws in our state, where DFEH says that, quote, as safe and effective vaccines against COVID-19 infection become more widely available. So this is dated, although it was just updated in February 16th of 2022. It says that you ought to, employers, quote, may wish to encourage their employees to get vaccinated. Now, there is some tension between the two of those statements, may encourage and requiring evangelism on vaccination, but they can be harmonized because Cal OSHA is saying tell employees that vaccines work. DFEH is saying employers should tell employees they should consider getting vaccinated. Neither statement is requiring vaccination mandates, which brings me to my next topic, the second topic, which is vaccine mandates. Except in limited areas, and you've heard Rob talk about this, such as healthcare and educational facilities and other high-risk settings, vaccine mandates are not legally required, but it is now, and of course in January of this year, the United States Supreme Court struck down the Biden administration's Occupational Safety and Health Administration, the federal agency, attempt to make large employers, defined as those with 100 or more employees, require that they have their employees vaccinated. The court majority incidentally ruled that that mandate exceeded the scope of authority that OSHA had to impose emergency standards. Nonetheless, though, it is important to understand that courts have now made it fairly clear, as have regulators, quite frankly, that private employers are allowed to mandate vaccination as long as, and this is an important caveat, as accommodations are made for those with bona fide religious objections and those with disabilities and medical conditions that make getting the vaccine unwarranted or unwise. These regulatory agencies, neither EEOC, which is the federal employment discrimination agency, nor the Department of Fair Employment Housing, Department of Fair Employment and Housing, takes a position with respect to whether employers may or should mandate vaccination of these vaccines. That said, the courts have weighed in, and you can go forward. I actually first raised this point in a law at work column in November of 2020 when these vaccines were first coming online. And without false modesty, it's incredible how durable that advice, that guidance in that column, which got a lot of attention because it was so out in front, has proven. The Los Angeles County of Public Health has posted a very good document, ladies and gentlemen, entitled, quote, Best Practices to Prevent COVID-19, Guidance for Businesses and Employers. That was just updated on April 1st, so just a few days ago. And the agency says that employers should encourage COVID-19 vaccination and booster doses. The agency writes, quote, and I'm quoting here, that's why I'm reading, make it easier for your employees to get fully vaccinated and boosted by providing paid time off to get vaccinated and to recover from any post-vaccinated side effects. And we'll get to a moment why paid supplemental leave actually requires that in some instances. Consider offering rewards such as additional paid time off or cash bonus payments and or implementing policies that require employees to be fully vaccinated and boosted against COVID-19, close quote. Now that said, courts and state and federal regulators have not confirmed that have now confirmed, as I said before, that private employers may mandate the vaccination. But when you're talking about bonuses and incentives, it's very important that when you're talking about the exceptions for religious and medical conditions and disabilities, that you don't exclude those folks from those incentives. That may be viewed as religious or disability discrimination. So you have to tread carefully when you're talking about offering incentives to get vaccination. The EEOC suggests as a best practice that, and again I'm quoting, an employer introduce a COVID-19 vaccination policy and requiring documentation or other confirmation of vaccination, and should notify all employees that the employer will consider requests for reasonable accommodation. Again, I think as Rob said, it's about transparency and making this fairly obvious to folks. EEOC has actually, I get a lot of questions about, well, what form do I use for religious accommodation? Because this is a big deal. Religious accommodations are considered on a case-by-case basis. And the EEOC actually has posted a form the agency uses for its own employees by which they evaluate a religious request for religious accommodations. And that is a form that you'll want to get. And when I refer to these links, I am going to be sending these as well to Summer, so that you folks have all of these. The important thing about that is that the employee completes one part of it, which explains the basis of the religious objection, and the agency actually has to complete the second part, which explains how the evaluation process. Obviously, that document is going to be critical should there be litigation. Here's an interesting twist that I felt I had to add. Interestingly, an employer may actually ask and the basis for an employee requesting a religious exemption to any COVID vaccination requirement, but may not ask the employee providing the medical exception the basis for that medical exception, other than a certification from a healthcare provider saying that it's warranted, as the EEOC puts it. But on the other hand, when you are talking about a religious exemption, you actually can ask for the basis for the religious exemption. But then you look at this second piece, where you have, on the other hand, an employee requesting a medical exemption can require a certification from a healthcare provider, but may not require a certification from a religious counselor for the religious exemption, because religion is viewed as a matter of individual conscience. And it doesn't matter that the vast majority of religions do not take a stand against vaccination. That's something that you have to keep in mind. The next topic I want to address, the third of the three topics that I was specifically asked to address, were the essentials of California's 2022 supplemental paid sick leave law. Now, I did a column on this that I actually converted to a fill-in for my class on managing legal issues in human resources that I teach at San Diego State, and I'll send that to you. And I leave the fill-ins in so that you can see the issues that I thought were important that I focused my students' attentions on. The first is that, of course, it doesn't apply to all employers. It doesn't even apply to most employers, numerically speaking. It only applies to employers that have 26 or more employees, and requires them to provide their employees with up to 80 hours of COVID-19 related paid sick leave. An employee is eligible for a maximum of $511 per day, up to $5,110 overall in benefits. Employers must publicly post a notice from the labor commissioner, which is now available, that describes the rights and duties. If employees don't frequently leave the workplace, the employer may provide that electronically. There are a series of frequently asked questions that the California Department of Industrial Relations has posted on this, and that I would suggest that you refer to. There are two different banks of leave. So there is a 40-hour bank of leave, which is the first bank of leave, which broadly speaking deals with vaccination and side effects from vaccination and boosters. I won't go into the specifics of all of that, but you will see that in the handout I give, because I'm sensitive about your very valuable time. Employees who generally work 40 hours a week are entitled to the full 40 hours of leave. The law provides a different way of calculating the amount of leave to which employees who work less than 40 hours per week are entitled. Eligibility for the second bank of leave. An employee is entitled to additional supplemental paid leave up to the amount available if the employee or an employer actually gets COVID-19. This is the second piece of this eligibility. But an employee has to provide documentation upon request, and if they don't, they're disqualified from getting that second bank of leave. This is an important point because it was one that was raised by a client early on with me. An employee need not exhaust the first bank of leave to access the second bank of 40 hours of leave. The frequently asked questions provides this illustration. A full-time employee can use 10 hours from the first bank to receive a COVID-19 vaccine booster shot and recover from symptoms, 40 hours from the second bank to care for a family member that tested positive for COVID-19, and then turn around and take 30 hours from the first bank to care for a child whose daycare has closed due to COVID-19 on the premises. Happily, thank God, that's not happening very much anymore. An employer may not require an employee to use employer-provided paid or unpaid leave, paid time off, or vacation time before the employee uses COVID-19 supplemental paid sick leave, or instead of that state mandated sick leave. An employee taking SPSL in the midst when the law expires in September is entitled to take the full amount of supplemental paid sick leave if they're in the middle of it. Let me quickly address other best practices. The California Chamber of Commerce itself, which is why this is so perfect, way before the pandemic, published tips for handling requests for leave. It said the guidance remains sound today. It says, quote, if nothing in the law, your policies, or your past practices indicates that you must grant the request for leave, then you are free to grant or deny it at your company's discretion. This is the kicker. Keep in mind, however, that this decision will set a precedent for future requests, close quote. Next tip, please remember that all medical information, including vaccination status and whether someone has COVID-19, is confidential and must be kept confidential. You cannot confirm the health status of any employee, And it is a bad idea to ask an employee who has tested positive COVID-19 if they are willing to waive that. Consider allowing telework, but telework is not a right. There are several other points, but I am running out of time, so I'm going to skip to this last point. As I said in my law at work column that was published just yesterday, the road to litigation is paved with good intentions. And I'm just quoting here from my column. The EEOC underscores that an employer may not make discriminatory decisions out of a benevolent concern for the employee. And for example, quoting from the EEOC, employers may not decline to assign female caregivers demanding or high-profile projects that increase employees' advancement potential, but require overtime or travel, or reassign such projects from female caregivers based on employers' assumption that such actions will make it easier for female employees to juggle work and personal obligations, or based on the belief that female caregivers cannot or would prefer not to work extra hours or be away from the family if a family member is infected or exposed with COVID-19. The same is true of requiring pregnant employees to telework to limit their contact with others. Employers may nonetheless grant exceptions to generally applicable policies. Preferably, though, that should be done with best practices at the employee's request. The challenge of doing a program like this, as I said, in many media outlets, and I just said the outset of this program, is we're dealing with a pandemic that continues to move faster than the speed of law. I conclude on a hopeful note, however. A sure sign of our collective success against this wearisome scourge will be that if the need for leave provided by the California Supplemental Paid Sick Leave Law all but expires before the law itself does. I'm happy to answer any questions at this point.
I thanks so much, Dan. This was an incredible wealth of knowledge and provided a lot of clarity, and at least some things that people may not have been thinking about. But as you mentioned earlier, in terms of offering incentives for time off for COVID vaccines, does that make it necessary to also offer the same thing similarly for like the flu vaccine? Is there a difference?
No, there is you don't have to offer the same thing with respect to flu vaccines. It is a very good question, Jason, because it gets to the point that COVID-19 is different and the law has addressed it differently. When you're talking about the accommodations and so forth, is that what you're talking about when you respect to flu vaccines?
Correct.
I mean, the bottom line is that to the extent that you can, and I think that Rob made this point, don't make employees pay for anything, whether you were talking about testing, whether you, of course, vaccination is free, but testing, masking, personal protective equipment, that all has to be borne by the employer.
Great. How can employees encourage boosters in the future, but stay within the bounds of the law? So when we say, quote, vaccines, should we assume that legally includes boosters as well? I know you touched upon a little bit that earlier.
Yes, the answer is yes, you can. The interesting word that was used was encourage. And a lot of people who are less bold than I was as a legal commentator have said encourage, but don't require. I said, well, no, you have the right actually as an employer, a private employer, to require. There are different requirements that apply in the unionized workplace that with respect to meet and confer, but I won't get into that. But yes, and that's why I said it's a best practice. Consider if you have a vaccine mandate, requiring it with respect to boosters as they become available. As I said, they're universally available with respect to the first booster. Only old people like me are eligible, and certain other people with immunocompromised are eligible for the second booster.
Is there a way, as what you're mentioning in terms of best practices, a certain form of engagement that provides the clearest way to be productive going forward with employees?
But see, that's a wonderful question, Jason, and it gets to the point of the requirement that the Cal OSHA regulations, the emergency temporary standards, will continue to have. And that is, it is useful to use one of these ubiquitous Zoom meetings, and it's ironic because we're on one right now, to engage your employees to say, we're going to have a candid discussion about ways that we can make our workplace safer. Because that's what, at the end of the day, this is all about. When we're talking about we're all in this together, that's clearly what this means. I would schedule a special Zoom meeting that says, here are some ideas that we have. We want to ask for your ideas as well, and have a frank discussion. Probably not a good idea to record it. I wouldn't record that Zoom meeting, although in these days, probably someone else will. but I would take very, very careful notes because it can only help on the broader mission of keeping everybody safe and getting us past this pandemic.
Great. I mean, you were so incredibly thorough. Usually you'll see a ton of questions come through, but it seems like you've been answering things as they've kind of come along. I'd like to open it up now to the group to see if there's any questions or additional questions folks might have for Dan.
Jason, I would like to offer also, folks, if you're interested, the column runs every 2 weeks, but sometimes, for reason passing understanding, people overlook it. I don't know why that would be. It should be destination reading. But if you want to get on my email distribution list, where I actually email it the day it is published, I'm happy to do that as well. So I obviously encourage you to subscribe to the San Diego Union Tribune. I'm not saying anything about that, but it's sometimes useful for you to have it in one place, then you can put it in a file and so forth. I found that people find that very, very useful. But I have covered, you're right, a broad array of topics, and I am going to send these notes to a Summer in the next couple of days for anyone who wants to review them.
Great, thank you. And that column actually in one of the articles was just dropped in the chat as well. So very thankful for the input and everything you provide. Everybody, Dan Eaton with Seltzer, Caplan, McMahon, Vitek, SCMV as we know them. Right. And just want to thank everybody for your time. And we hope you've been able to come away with the session with a greater and better and more thorough understanding of how to interpret state and local COVID-19 business guidance. And sure enough, we have a lot of resources here we'll be following up with everybody on, and ways to go forward. So once again, thank you so much to the San Diego Regional Chamber of Commerce for having me and all of our guests. Once again, thank you again so much, and looking forward to working with you all.